November 26, 1987, the culmination of a very, very long battle between two rival promotions, one based out of New York, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation headed by Vince McMahon Sr., that was bought by Vince McMahon Jr. in 1982 and rebranded the World Wrestling Federation, and then he went all over the world. We're going to take over, pal. Ha ha ha. Meanwhile, in the Carolinas, Jim Crockett Promotions, first run by Jim Crockett Sr., and then when he passed away in the early 70s, Jim Crockett Jr. took over and decided to expand from the Carolinas, Virginia, into the Northeast and even out west, and decided to take over various promotions and work with other promotions to just basically continue to expand and promote Mid-Atlantic wrestling to the masses. And then we had Starrcade 1983, and then we had other battles. We had other markets where they were going head-to-head. And then Vince McMahon decided to use Black Saturday and basically get Jim Crockett Jr. to pay $1 million to get the TBS time slot back and get the money, among others, like from Antonio Inoki, $1 million to help fund the first WrestleMania because he got the idea from the first ever Starrcade in 1983. And then he decided to go to 3 locations for Mania 2. And then Mania 3 was the culmination of all the swallowing up of talent, and my goddamn goodness, what a spectacle that was. Meanwhile, Jim Crockett Jr. was running a money-making machine, but then by 1987 was buying up various wrestling promotions and expanding way too goddamn fast. The talent was spread way too thin, and then it was all gonna come to a head when they took Starrcade 1987 out of Greensboro and put it in Chicago, a really hot market. But then Vince McMahon said, I'm going to fuck with you, Jim Crockett Jr. You thought Black Saturday was bad? We're going to get you today, pal. Ha ha ha. I'm going to force the companies to choose between me or you. Ha ha ha. Well, what a day it was. Let's talk about it, shall we? I'm John Redland with my real honest thoughts on Survivor Series 1987 versus Starrcade 1987. The day the war basically died. I mean, let's be perfectly honest. Like, if you know anything about the history, this is pretty much the cementing by Vince McMahon of being, better at playing mind games and playing political games over Jim Crockett Jr., who was in over his head, like Lit on the Titan AE soundtrack. Boy, that's a goddamn old reference, but yeah. November 26, 1987, a day that will live in infamy. I mean, there's a lot of history to dive into. I'm going to touch on some of it. And I've talked about this when I did my Starrcade 1987 retro review, and when I've talked about Jim Crockett and Vince McMahon being head-to-head, but just all this stuff. You've learned it from Shoot Interviews, WWE Productions, the Jim Cornette podcast, because he was in the middle of it, and various other talents that were on both sides. And there were a lot of talent trades. Maybe not so much trades, but there were people that were like, okay, we don't like how things are working here. We're going to go over here. And the thing is, revisionist history, though, by Vince McMahon. Oh, well, I just decided to put a pay-per-view on. It's not my fault that he couldn't compete, pal. Ha ha. The thing is, you have to go back and look at the history of what Jim Crockett Jr. did, for good, bad, or indifferent, and then see what led to Starrcade 87 being enough of a success that the crowd was pretty goddamn hot, but there were decisions leading up to it and at that event that made you think, maybe he doesn't really know exactly what he's doing. Then the Bunkhouse Stampede, that was a pay-per-view that didn't work because they were in the Nassau Coliseum when they had no business being there. They were in the UIC Pavilion in Chicago, but before that, gotta talk about the history. So yes, Jim Crockett Sr. ran it from the early to late 30s till I think 72, 73, around that. He passed away, and then Jim Crockett Jr. ended up taking over the promotion a little bit later. And what ended up happening is they were just running in the Carolinas, they were running in Virginia, and they were making quite a bit of money, making good, solid money, and there was a lot of great talent. And George Scott came in to become the booker. And he changed it from being just tag team based stuff to being centered around, the main title. Johnny Valentine was a big part of that. Unfortunately, the plane crash ended up ending his career. Same plane that Ric Flair was in. He was able to come back and become one of the greatest of all time. And they continued to expand because they would go into other markets because there was a demand for it. The syndicated TV, the Mid-Atlantic TV tapings, all, where it was based out of. I mean, it was based out of a converted convenience store in Charlotte. And the fact that they had a setup where things were working, Jim Crockett Jr. just trusted the wrong people when the expansion got absolutely insane. And they had, there was the Georgia Championship Wrestling crew, the Atlanta crew, and that stuff would eventually get swallowed up sometime in 85. But Great American Bash, like 85, that was a big success. That was a really big success. And that was just one show. And then Great American Bash 86, okay, they didn't draw in every single market, but they drew in enough markets. They had big stadiums, and they had a lot of money that they earned. I think it was like 2.something million, 2.3, 2.5 million in $86, which would probably be around 5-6 million today, depending on the inflation. And people would pocket, thousands and thousands of dollars. Dusty and Flair probably pocketed the most out of, besides Jim Crockett. And there were others that got paid pretty goddamn well. And then 87 was a little bit scaled back as far as like being in stadiums, but they would still be in stadiums, but they would be more in strongholds. But during 87 is really where things started to get dicey. And the reason they got dicey is because, as the aforementioned Mania 3 attendance, 93,173 people, complete bullshit, by the way, 78 to 80,000 is about what I believe for the Silverdome. Great to be back here in the Silverdome. That'll haunt Hogan forever, among other things. That was kind of the final stamp and the final foot on the chest, roughly, or, to use that cliche, of Vince McMahon basically saying, hey, pal, I've just been smarter as far as marketing and everything. And I've got you under my boot, and you're not getting out. AWA by that point was basically a wasteland. World Class wasn't drawing shit. They would not draw anything to the Mike Von Erich Memorial. There was Dave Von Erich, Mike Von Erich Memorial. They would draw like I don't even think they drew 7,000 people at Texas Stadium. I think 7,000 was the attendance for the 88 one. I don't even think they drew 6,000 for the 87 version. AWA was doing tapings at the Showboat, or they were about to do tapings at the Showboat. They were doing some stuff. They were doing, various TV tapings and everything, and going to certain markets and taping a bunch of TV, and then having certain events. They would have Super Clash 2, because Super Clash 3 was in 88, and boy, what a mess that was. It was like 3,000 people at the Cow Palace, which, by the way, if you don't know anything about the Cow Palace holds significantly more than that. Even if you cut the venue in half, that still wouldn't have even filled up half the bowl. But Jim Crockett made like 21 million in 86 and was doing some good stuff. But the problem is, Florida, after Eddie Graham's suicide, would unfortunately go by the wayside. I mean, Florida, I don't know if it could have been necessarily as hot, given even with the working relationship he could have had with Vince Jr., because Vince Sr. respected Eddie Graham so much and Vince Jr. understood that. I don't know if Florida would have lasted. So Florida was being worked with the NWA, Jim Crockett Jr., and then Central States, the Kansas City territory. Basically, it was on its goddamn ass by that point, because after Sam Muchnick retired in St. Louis, that was going away. And then there were other, there were other territories that were being swallowed up. Memphis still had some business. Actually, I think Memphis was probably one of the few that wasn't as hurt, because they were centralized and they were doing their stuff. And Bill Watts' Mid-South, which changed into Universal Wrestling Federation, wasn't doing all that well, especially by 87, because there was the oil bust, and there was the fact that, Junkyard Dog and other people had left in years prior. They didn't have as much talent as they used to. And even though Mid-South, from a television presentation standpoint, had done well for years, especially after Bill Watts had gotten control of the Leroy McGurk portion, which was Oklahoma, and I forget where else he ran. Mostly Oklahoma. I can't imagine he ran in Kansas, because I have a feeling we don't want to be in Kansas anymore. But the whole point is they were swallowing up these various promotions. I think it was like 3 to 4 million that he paid Bill Watts for the Universal Wrestling Federation. Acquire the rights to it, the talent, all that stuff. And the thing is that it wasn't brought in as a comparable force. Now, the way this ties to Starrcade 87 is there were various championships that they had going on. Florida had their Battle of the Belts, NWA Battle of the Belts, which I think there was one in 85. There were two in 86. I'm trying to remember the exact timeline. Because by 87, Florida was just dead. Florida was totally done. And by especially by late 87, and all these territories were bought up by Jim Crockett Jr., which seemed like a great idea. The thing is he could have let some of those age out instead of paying for the people from Florida. Acquiring some people from Florida is one thing, but paying for central states, Kansas City, because you feel bad, all this stuff, buying these basically dead territories, sending talents out to do these TV tapings. Big Bubba was able to get experience in Kansas City and do some stuff, and then come back and be a big drawing monster heel against Dusty, the War Games matches, and then a show, I believe, in Pittsburgh, which was a great indoor record, 16,000 some odd people for the finals of the Bunkhouse Stampede. All this stuff was swelling, and they were doing some great business, but also because of the amount of money that they were paying out to these various promoters to buy their stuff, and sending all these crews out, sending all these talents out, even though talents were covering their own costs, sending out the TV, that was costing them, doing all this stuff, not having rights fees and other ways to get more revenue coming back in, because they had a ton of money on the books. And Greensboro had been a big hotbed. Charlotte had been a big hotbed. The Carolinas and other stuff, the Mid-Atlantic area was cooking. They were doing great business there. The problem is they were also going to the West Coast, when, yes, you could go to San Francisco, you go to Oakland, you could drop, but when you're going to the Forum, the LA Forum, which I guarantee you was quite a pretty penny to just rent, the Superdome, they had a Superdome show in, I want to say it was during the Great American Bash Tour in 87, and Bill Watts couldn't draw in the goddamn Superdome. I think it was 4,000 or 5,000 people tops. It cost them more to get out of there. But then they would make money in some stadiums. They would do good stuff, but they just kept spreading themselves too thin. Now, that being said, if you take a look at Starrcade's history, the idea came from Dusty Rhodes. Like the Eddie Graham package shows and everything. I believe Dory Funk Jr. actually was booking the first one. And Dusty was there as kind of the figurehead. And Jim Crockett Jr. was there as the money guy. And Starrcade 83 was a big deal. And 83 and 84 were just in Greensboro. And then the idea came, hey, let's do simulcast. Let's do closed circuit television, closed circuit broadcast to theaters around in these, like they did for boxing, they did for other wrestling events. AWA did that stuff. LA did it. LA was very popular doing that in the 60s and 70s with closed circuiting instead of being at the... the Olympic Auditorium. They would do their closed circuit thing, and that would be big business. Unfortunately, LA kind of dried up, especially well before Starrcade came around. But let's just take a look at the facts and figures as far as Greensboro for 1983. And money figures are a little bit off because you would have to take a look at a figure book and stuff like that. So this is pretty much just guesswork by me. But 1983 in Greensboro, and it was a snowstorm. It was a big, big snowstorm. That was unusual snow for Greensboro at that time. 15,000, almost 15,500 fans. 500 grand for the gate, and 30,000 watching on closed circuit. And for a snowstorm, it's pretty goddamn good. It was a pretty penny. Given them a card, you could take a look at that card. That's a lot of money they paid out to the town, but they got their money there. They got big, big business, and they were booming. They took it to 1984, which honestly, 1984 Starrcade is not all that great. At all. In Greensboro, 16,000 people. Big gate. Since it was 16,000, I imagine even if the prices were increased by $1 each, they made well over 500 grand, and they had more closed circuit. Circuitry. They had more locations and everything. So they were doing great business there. And then the Great American Bash in 1985. And then we go to 1985 Starrcade. Now, mind you, Mania 86, so Mania 2, was in 3 locations. Well, Crockett did it first. Crockett did it first as far as on a big scale. You had Greensboro and Atlanta, combined attendance of 30 grand, and that's pretty close to a sellout for both venues. I think the Greensboro Coliseum, 16,000. I think the Omni was about the same, 16, maybe 17,000. So pretty close to a sellout. And you have to imagine the gate was probably close to 1 million when you combine those and the closed circuit television, probably even over 1 million. Because the combined attendance of those would have indicated 500 grand minimum each venue, and then closed circuit locations. So they're expanding, they're doing great stuff, and they are rocking and rolling, strutting and strolling. After 84, when it was a little bit rough, 85, things are kicking in. They did the Great American Bash Tour in 1986. They did do the Liberty Bowl, which did not do well at all, but they were doing others that were doing great business. Very, very good business. And then they do Greensboro and Atlanta again. 30,000 combined attendance, so it's hard to tell which one was fuller, but maybe they were both about the same. The problem is the Starrcade 86 is 4 hours long. That was a bit rough. In fact, that was very rough. It was the first wrestling tape to go gold, which, however, that meant back then. I don't actually remember what the number is. The whole point is that Jim Crockett Promotions was doing great stuff here. 86 was pretty much their high point, 21 million, and all that. Then, unfortunately, 87, the Great American Bash Tour did pretty well, but they were starting to make some questionable decisions. All the aforementioned talent that they were bringing in, all the company or all the territories they were swallowing up, spending the extra money. And after the Great American Bash Tour in the fall, they were kind of going a little bit here and there. There were some territories, or there were some cities they were drawing good in, and in others that were having problems, either repeat business, people were down on the card, whatever it was. In September of that year, Ron Garvin beats Ric Flair and wins the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Now, in Starrcade 86, what ended up hurting them in the long run was losing Magnum TA just before that. Because Magnum TA should have been the heir apparent. Even if I think Magnum probably would have flamed out by 1995, they would have gotten more business out of him, and he would have definitely improved. And he would have been the guy that could have carried it for a while. Probably as a face and then as a heel winning it back, because I think he could have worked great as a heel. So, all that stuff with the business and all swallowing up the territories. Now we go to Chicago, the UIC Pavilion. Not the Rosemont Horizon, but the UIC Pavilion, because the Rosemont was on lock from by Vince McMahon. So Greensboro had done all this great business and everything. 500 grand, all that. 16,000 some odd people. The UIC Pavilion did not hold nearly that many. Now, they did 8,000 people. I think the UIC Pavilion, that's close to a sellout, or it's about 10 grand. But the point is they had to go to a big media market. I don't know how many closed circuit locations they had there, because even though they had done a lot of sellouts in Chicago, they ended up 150 grand, a third of what they, a third minimum. It might have even been like a quarter of what they did in Greensboro. Maybe they ended up doing 200 grand because the ticket prices may have been higher. But the whole point is, they didn't even do close to what they did in Greensboro. Didn't have nearly as many closed circuit locations. All the stuff that they were doing, the tours, kind of having a bit of an issue in some markets, spreading people too thin. And then the big thing, Ron Garvin wasn't going to draw people as champion. Nothing against Ron Garvin. Rugged Ronnie Garvin, hands of stone, great talent. Great talent, tough, legit, was believable in the ring because he would lay his shit in and could beat you in a shoot if he wanted to. There's the stuff about him and Hawk, Hawk wanting to get, into a friendly shoot, and that didn't work. But it was on the 86 tour, I think. I think it was 86. But the big thing, the Road Warriors were in their gimmick hometown. They faced off against Tully and Arn for the tag titles, and they didn't win. They did DQ, schmaz, over the top rope, second referee, Dusty finish and all that, and the crowd said bullshit. The crowd said bullshit. They weren't happy. They were pissed. They were like, how dare you? What the hell? What is this? And even though they would draw big crowds in Chicago, they would never do sellouts again. In part because of this. It killed the Chicago sellout streak. Because Dusty was starting to get far back in the weeds. I mean, he even beat Lex Luger for the U.S. title like I believe right after that in a steel cage match. I've seen the event, but you'll have to forgive me. A lot of this stuff's jumbled in my head. And Ric Flair beat Ron Garvin to win the NWA Championship. So all this stuff's going on, but that's okay. Even if the gate's down, it's not what Greensboro was. At least they'll make money on pay-per-view. Except Vince McMahon basically threatened the entire, all the pay-per-view companies, the pay-per-view outlets said, if you carry Jim Crockett's show, I won't give you WrestleMania 4. Now, I want you to think about that, because they had the closed circuit thing for Mania 1, Mania 2, Mania 3, and then I believe 4 was going to be on pay-per-view. And even, and then 5 was going to be on full-fledged pay-per-view. I'm trying to remember the exact thing. But the whole point is, Mania 4 needed the pay-per-view money because closed circuit could only do so much. Even though they made great money in the house. I mean, the 78 to 80,000 still in the Silverdome would say something. Say a lot, because, I mean, the noise would echo and engulf and everything in a stadium that big, and what an atmosphere. But they're like, okay, well, he's done all this success. We don't know who Jim Crockett Jr. is because we don't know anything about wrestling. But Vince McMahon here, this guy in this very, very loud suit with this weird hair and coke to the goddamn gills, likely, is threatening to pull stuff. And we know him, but we don't know this guy. So a few pay-per-view companies gave their word and carried Jim Crockett's pay-per-view. The problem is they had even thought about it for a fraction of a second. Was said, wait a second. This guy is going to cut off his nose to spite his face. This guy's going to do this stuff, hamper his own business. If we carry this, well, let's just let him do that. But they were too stupid to realize that he was just bluffing. He had no cards. He was just bluffing. And so there was some pay-per-view money, but not great. And then what also didn't help, again, the aforementioned going from Greensboro with all this money. So if they'd been in Greensboro, sure, the Road Warriors could have not won. The crowd might have booed, but they would have sold out in Greensboro still. They didn't sell out in Chicago, one of their biggest market, or they, after this, didn't sell out in Chicago, didn't do this. And they killed that. And the pay-per-view payoffs, people were having issues, because they felt they deserved more money. The Rock and Roll Express left because of a pay dispute after being part of a scaffold match the year after the Midnight Express and Road Warriors did their Skywalker's match, scaffold match, and Big Bubba got up there. Now everybody on the team, Jim Cornette, Stan Lane, Bobby Eaton got 10 grand. Bubba got up there and only did a little something. He didn't fall because God forbid it would have killed him. Rest in peace, Ray Traylor, by the way, but that would have ended his career well before it ever got really going. And he got only 5 grand, and he decided, I'm just going to go and see if Vince wants me. Oh, they do, and then he's earning 10 to 12 grand a week facing up against Hogan during their house show tour and still earning thousands of dollars every single week. And because of Dusty, Jim Crockett Jr., and all these decisions I talked about, that was pretty much it. And the spectacle of Mania 3 pretty much finished off any of those territories, as I mentioned, and then Jim Crockett does the Bunkhouse Stampede finals in the Nassau Coliseum, which I think it was like 6,000 people maybe, and in an arena that holds a whole lot more than that. And then, yes, they did the Clash of the Champions. They did that. They did ding WrestleMania because they were a big TV special. Cable companies were upset then finally after the Mania 5 and the Clash special that George Scott didn't promote in the Superdome. So it was like 5 grand in a 60,000 seat stadium. Actually, I think it might be 70,000 in the Superdome. The whole point is that even if you had 20,000, you would have been better. But don't promote it. No, you couldn't do that. But that's way out in the future. The immediate aftermath of November 26, 1987 was basically that Vince McMahon had put his foot on Jim Crockett Jr.'s chest, and even though there was still comparable business in 88, the damage that they did to themselves in 87 is what led to it. But that could have all been turned around if Vince McMahon hadn't done what he did, effing up the whole pay-per-view system just because he had to be greedy. And by the way, Survivor Series 1987 did 21,300 people in the Richfield Township in Ohio. Check out my retro view of Starrcade. Survivor Series 92, which is also at the Richfield Township in Ohio. 4 multi-man matches, And they even had rivals, people that were rivals earlier in the year on the same team, like Savage and Steamboat. And I never understood that at all. That was really stupid. But Vince McMahon, he played his cards right, even though he was just totally bluffing. And that's it. That's it, basically, what happened. That's a timeline right there, as best as I can describe. Do you think business would have been any different for Jim Crockett Promotions if Starrcade 87 had been a success? It could have been, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, Twitter handle in the description. I'm John Retlin. I'll see you soon.